law firms and governments, who now stepped forward to fill the ranks of the fledgling agency. Many of them hailed from a concentration in Washington of 100 or so wealthy families known as the cave dwellers, who stood for the preservation of the Episcopalian and Presbyterian values that had guided their ancestors. Schooled in the principles of robust intellect, athletic prowess, politesse, and solid Christian ethics, they took their example from men like the Reverend Endicott Peabody, whose Groton School, run along the lines of Eton, Harrow, and Winchester, was the alma mater of so many national leaders. Trained in the Christian virtues and the duties of privilege, they emerged believing in democracy but wary of unchecked egalitarianism. Reversing Willy Brandt's celebrated declaration, "We are the elected of the people, not the elect," this was the elect who had not been elected. And then on page 96 of this particular book, and this goes into culture because this is what it was all about. Most of the Cold War had nothing to do with espionage as we think of it. It was to do with a battle for people's minds. Both the Soviets, or the Soviet elite, and the elite of the US and Britain and other countries in Europe were more afraid of the minds of the public being stolen by the winners. And therefore all propaganda that came out on all sides was aimed to direct the mindset of the general public, who hadn't a clue. But that's what it was all about. It says here, William Colby, a future CIA director, reached the same conclusion. The communists made no secret of their belief in what they called the organizational weapon. I started off the show talking about the fact that people down below, the masses, who are probably the most enlightened slaves that's ever existed, with more information, there's no organization amongst them. It says the communists made no secret of their belief in what they called the organizational weapon. Organize the party as the key command troop, but then organize all the other fronts. The women's groups, the cultural groups, the trade unions, the farmer groups, the cooperatives, a whole panoply of organizations so that you can include as many of the people in the country as possible within those groups, and thereby under basically communist leadership and even discipline. While the US and its think tanks, and it mentions in here the CFR too, being one of them, realized that they would have to outsmart the communists. At least that's what they tell us. Remember, the whole project, if you go further back in history, was to get the dialectic going between two sides. But the East and the West, it was very clear cut. And out of the end of it, according to the Foundations, and the good book to read is Foundations, Their Power and Influence, from the Rees Commission that was done in the 1950s with Senator Dodd, who had to investigate how the big foundations and why the big foundations seemed to be sponsoring what seemed to be the most fervent communist groups. Because the CIA, it seems, did create some of the most left-wing groups of all. Therefore, those who were inclined to go left-wing would join their groups instead. That's quite the plan. And they came up with the idea of promoting, or what the Soviet system hated and called the Americans, promoting what they called decadence through the arts. That was the visual arts, drama, music, painting, altering the culture completely, and also through the novels that would get churned out like crazy. And which they did. It definitely did affect everyone who grew up in the so-called Cold War. Remember, in the Cold War, too, the people weren't taking it seriously enough in a lot of the countries. It was Bernays who came up with the idea, Bernays that I mentioned last week, who came up with the idea of training the children to get under their tables in the classroom to get it home to them that this was real, to make them afraid. It says here, the directive concluded that practical and ideological considerations both impel us to the conclusion that we have no choice but to demonstrate the superiority of the idea of freedom by its constructive application. Truth also needs propaganda, the philosopher Karl Jaspers had recently declared. Here was the mandate which authorized America's cold warriors to take constructive measures to ensure that the truth triumphed over deceit. The budgetary provisions set out by NSC-68 revealed the importance now given to this task. In the next 2 years, the $34 million spent on psychological warfare in 1950 was to be quadrupled. That's when they really took over the entire culture industry of the West, and they set up branches in every country throughout Europe and Scandinavia and ran them. They ran the cultures. It says here, in the contest for men's minds, truth can be peculiarly the American weapon, Secretary of State Edward Barrett announced. It cannot be an isolated weapon because the propaganda of truth is powerful only when linked with concrete actions and policies. A highly skillful and substantial campaign of truth is an indispensable as an air force. He meant propaganda, though. And truth, like the century, was to belong to America. That's what they called it, the New American Century. If deceit needed to be used to promote the truth, then so be it. That's what Arthur Kessler called fighting against a total lie in the name of a half-truth. The purpose of the IOD, said Braden, was to unite intellectuals against what was being offered in the Soviet Union. And I'll go into this because it's very interesting. It's quite a deep book, and there's lots of facts in it. Back in a few minutes. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and we're cutting through the matrix, and we're discussing the techniques used during the Cold War. And we've got to keep in mind that if the CIA was running the cultural industry right up until the Berlin Wall fell down, they would never give it up afterwards. In other words, they're still running it. The author of this particular book did a lot of research and she tried to get information from the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act. She was told that even the few questions she'd asked and the access to some documents would cost up to $30,000. So she had to go into private archives from people who'd been in the CIA and get access to this kind of data. As I say, remember, this book pertains also to not only to where we are today, how we got here, but where they're going, because this is the most powerful tool ever. You are, in a sense, your culture. Whatever culture is given to you, you are it. You're in it. You dress like it. You sing the songs of it. You talk about the novels that are churned out. You talk about all the different things that captivate your mind, like everyone else around you. It's all churned out by the culture industry. Because it's a battle, as I say, for the mind. You control people through the information, through the data you give to them. Remember what Brzezinski said, the public will shortly be unable to think for themselves. He said that in the 1970s. That's what's happened. They feed us the data, we parrot it to each other. We all think we're normal because we're all talking about the same things all the time. And they have specific areas and different age groups they target. They have one for every age group. It says here, the purpose of the IOD, said Braden, was to unite intellectuals against what was being offered in the Soviet Union. The idea that the world would succumb to a kind of fascist or Stalinist concept of art and literature and music was a horrifying prospect. We wanted to unite all the people who were artists, who were writers, who were musicians, and all the people who followed those people to demonstrate that the West and the United States was devoted to freedom of expression and to intellectual achievement without any rigid barriers as to what you must write and what you must say, and what you must do and what you must paint, which was what was going on in the Soviet Union. I think we did it damn well, said Braden. And at that time, when the world was being turned upside down, all this weird art would come out. And people would think it was all the left-wingers that were doing it. It wasn't. It was the CIA.